We're going to get started in just a second, everyone. All right, welcome everyone to Politics and Prose Live. We're here tonight with Jill Bialosky and Yiyun, and they're going to be discussing their new books. But before we get to that, I just want to bring your attention to two quick things. The first is that we highly encourage everyone to purchase tonight's books. There's going to be links in the chat column that I will post momentarily, and you can click on those and that'll direct you to Politics and Prose's website. We're doing $5 media mail shipping, and we're also doing curbside pickup if you're interested. And so it's a great way to support our authors and to also support Politics and Prose. The second thing I'd like to let everyone know is that the latter portion of tonight's event will be devoted to your audience questions. And you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You just click on that and type in your question, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. We do have a chat column as well, but if you could just try to keep your questions to the Q&A box, it just makes things a little bit easier. With that out of the way, I'm pleased to be joined tonight by two extremely talented writers. Jill Bialosky has written 4 collections of poetry, 3 novels, and several memoirs. Tonight she'll be discussing her new collection, Asylum, which contains 103 poems and prose segments that form a coherent narrative. We are also joined by Yiyun, who has previously written 6 books of fiction and 1 memoir. She will be discussing her new novel, Must I Go, which is about a woman examining her life and the life of a former lover. Both books are drawing rave reviews, and I think we're in for a real treat tonight. And so now I'm going to turn it over to our 2 authors.
Jill, shall I go first?
Yes, thank
Yes.
you. So great.
Thank you. Yes. Good evening. I think, Jill and I are going to both read just very short period of reading, and I'm going to go first. I'm going to read from my new novel, Must I Go? So the novel is about an older woman reading her ex-lover or one lover's diary at the end of her life. So I'm going to read 3 just very short excerpt. One is the opening page, and one is 1 page of the man's diary, and one is Lilia, the main character. She started to annotate the diary. So I'm going to read 1 page of her annotation. So this is the opening paragraph. Posterity, take notice. The exhortation or the plea appeared 23 times in Roland Bully's diaries. Every time Lilia read the line, she reassured him, yes, Roland, I'm here, taking notice. If one of her children in their younger years had asked her not to ever die, Lilia would have spoken with equal certainty, I never will. But that was a promise made to be broken. Roland had not asked for the impossible, only the eternal. Who else could be his posterity but her? The single volume of his diaries, over 700 pages, was the only book Roland had published. He had culled 60 years of entries and left instructions to have them printed by a friend's press. He had left everything to Peter and Anne Wilson, his wife, Hetty's favorite niece. Lilia disapproved of the Wilsons, resented them wholeheartedly. They had edited Roland's diaries from 3 volumes into 1, inserting ellipses where records should have been kept intact. The first time she read the book, Lilia had sent a letter to Aubrey Lane Press. The address a P.O. box in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. What arrogance to say that Roland's journals were at times repetitive. Life is repetitive, she wrote. Loyalty to a dead man should be the editor's foremost requirement. She had received no reply. So that's the opening, and just a short page of Roland's diary. Roland kept the diary all his life. So this is at the beginning of his life. He was 19 on this page. July 1st, 1929. At tea time, Aunt E joked about cousinhood being the only dangerous neighborhood, and I pretended that I did not notice Hetty's twisting fingers. There's plenty of time for her to outgrow her ardor for me. For now, she comes in handy. When she is here for the summer, the role of the chaperone falls to Aunt E. To spend time with Hetty, I'm sorry, that's my dog, means to live nearer Aunt E than at any other time of the year. My cousinly duty to Hetty is a convenient pretext. My love for Aunt E, the context of my existence. Reading Ovid last night, I wondered what plant or beast I deserved to be transformed into if I announced my passion. Will Aunt E remain my sole love? One must be careful not to place one's heart in a cage that can be unlocked by only one key. I desire, however, for Aunt E to acknowledge my love, accept it even. No matter, my poor dead parents would not have approved, nor would any of my relatives. Yet is this not the world's due to an orphan who must be granted rights to the uncommon, even the forbidden? One is not orphaned for nothing. What a scandal we could make. I do believe I shall be able to make a great novel out of this love for Aunt E. And just one very short passage. This is Lydia later in her life, annotating Roland's diary. And here she's talking about closure. Closure. I wonder if my great-grandmother Lucille ever thought about that. What's the point of closure? One at any moment, you could tumble off your mule into the valley and never see another day again. Or your best pal could hack you to death at night so he could run away with your $200 worth of gold. Rattlesnakes and grizzly bears and floods and snowstorms. Would they be so kind to wait until you find closure? And the man whom great-grandmother Lucille took care of, both his legs amputated, just lying there waiting for death. What use would he have had for that comforting word? There was this young Miwok mother, 14, really still a girl, when her white husband was crushed by a fallen tree and her tribe refused to take her and her baby back. Great-grandmother Lucille made a place for them in her household. When the baby died, the young mother returned to her tribe. Did she think about closure then? Did great-grandmother Lucille, who was said to have treated the girl as her own daughter, the baby her grandchild? Gilbert was right. I'm as hard as the hardest life. My love is as hard as I am. I came from a settler's family. Like a settler, I have lived through the bumps and wounds and amputations and deaths. I don't mope. Give me an axe and a hoe, and I'll start a garden. Give me a good man, and I'll build a family with him. Anything I can do, I do it with all my might. But I don't fight storms and floods and earthquakes. I don't deceive myself into thinking I can be who I am not. I'm going to stop here.
Beautiful, Yiyun, thank you. I'm going to read my book is called Asylum, a personal historical natural inquiry in 103 lyric sections. And it's conceived as a book-length poem or essay or inquiry. And I'll read, and I'm dealing with themes of survival and extinction and asylum, what it means to find and seek asylum. So I'm going to read 8 sections that sort of go throughout the book. We kept our heads down. We were entranced, focused. Sometimes we could not see anything before us. That's what it required. One year I had forgotten the first leaves of spring. I had forgotten all the years of toil. I looked up and trees had flowered. All it took was waiting out the bleak winter, the hemisphere of darkness. The color was lime green. I wanted to tell her, this is what it's like. Every April, a requiem, a reawakening of dawn, the same chorus and players, the garage door sealed, gas turned on, and the girl once aidled by a broken heart, by a mind that won't stop, by the ticker tape of loneliness. There she is again, slumped against the door, hair tangled around her neck, effervescent eyes closed, rings and bracelets catching the hint of morning sun. The myth of the girl unraveling when the boy who arrives to cut the lawn opens the garage door to fetch the lawnmower and finds her. The birds are trumpets and flutes, the wind a piano, daffodils are frozen, shock of forsythia withering in the cold, tulips trampled, pollen has not yet released, buds not yet opened. It is April again, and all the trees bow for the final coda. Pollen is everywhere. Blossoms are at the very edge of becoming, and there is no more winter. Global warming is destroying our idea of what we've come to know, except for the winters of our memory, winters where the girl in the blue snowsuit, a sister, tasted snow for the first time. There is no more winter except for the winters of our memory, winters where we mourned, trapped in the mind's circling inferno and could not get out. Winter where the boy surpassed the age in which his mother's sister, forever young, departed. Hustling her new book on NPR, a marriage counselor says most marriages survive out of kindness. Romanticism has been a detriment to us, a philosopher cants. The reason motherhood was largely excised from poetry before the 1960s is because poets feared exposing truth to their offspring or sentimentalizing their art, says the poet on podcast. At lunch with a writer I admire, I listened to her describe her experience. My editor did not understand it, so I had to frame it for her, and my words became my book. What about the daily care of children? How does this enter the poem? The poet insists. The words became my book. Snow of childhood, of dreams, of our poems and discontent. Snow of our memories, some distorted, forgotten, trod upon, rendered to a whiteout. Snow that dusts bridges, highways, roofs, that tastes of rust and weighs on the branches. Oh, don't forget them. Insufferable snow that falls on the pots that hold the pods of the dead in the brilliance of the outdoor gazebo we see from the window of the care home for the aged to praise our matriarch. Our boots wet, snow in our hair. Look how pale she is. Look what she has bore, those veins in which flowed the blood that flowed into us. In yoga class, the teacher says Utkatasana, or awkward pose, chair pose, comes from the ancient stance of two warriors in opposition. In this pose, we place our standing feet together, our chest out, and our arms stretched by our ears, and squat without losing alignment in our back. Utkatasana comes from the Sanskrit ukata, which means fierce, proud, high, haughty, superior, immense, large, difficult. It is a warrior pose. You must breathe through your struggle, she says. Set your intention, breathe. I don't know if I was still in dream when I awoke and heard the faint sound. It was like someone moaning. I kept hearing it again and again, still coming awake through the pane in the window. Later, I discovered wasps had made a nest in the crack of wood outside underneath the frame, their nests made of paper where I sleep. It was the hum of the brush of the wind creating a vibration in the wind. What a lot of effort living. Sometimes when they loom over a flower, they catch pollen in their wings and bring it back to their larva. And this is the last one I'll read. Once, due to disease, we had to cut down a tree to its stump, hoping the roots might sprout again around the edges and regenerate. To determine her age, still a baby in terms of the life of trees, we counted the number of circles inside the bark's circumference. 21 rings circled her breadth. 21 years bequeathed to the warmth of the sun, pull from the moon, water from the earth, 7,665 days, 183,960 hours, 11,37,600 minutes in which her long arms, locked in the roots and branches of sister trees, shared their sugars, were awash in daylight, and if a storm, suffered, shaking in brutal darkness. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Beautiful. Jill.
Thank you, Yiyun.
Shall I start asking you a question? And then we
Okay, that sounds good. And then
Yeah.
I'll follow with one for you.
Yes. You've talked about this poem, long poem, is conceived as a long poem with 103 segments. I'm just curious about the process of writing this long poem, and where and when did you start? When did that poem take the shape as we see now?
Yes, thank you. It was a very circular process and a strange process, because I remember that I started wanting to write. My other previous poetry books are more lyric poems or narrative poems, but there was something about 2016 where I felt that the poem needed to stretch further out. And I began it really thinking about how all these years I became a writer and how I found a path to become a poet. And that was kind of the beginning of Asylum. But then, we had a new administration and the world just kept feeling more and more difficult and full of unrest. And I kind of allowed all of these threads into Asylum. They kind of just took over there are voices from the yoga teacher who's like this calming voice. And then I have voices of other poets like Paul Celan and Dante. And the book is kind of a journey through unrest and darkness toward hope, I would say. So it really became quite changeable. I don't know if as a fiction writer that happens for you in your process, but I just found that once I hit on a thread, I came back to it again. And some of the book takes place out in I think 20 years of my looking at a particular stand of trees and how they've evolved over the years. So nature also sort of evolves into the poem as an idea of this idea of what survives and what we pass on, if that makes sense to you.
Beautiful. Well said.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to ask you, I just have been reading your novel with such interest, and it's so poignant, and there's so much depth to the book itself. But what I was so interested in was the way in which you balance the quotidian, the everyday lives of these characters, and yet the novel, for me, feels like it seeks to explore really very, very profound questions about life and death and grief and love. And yet you do it with these characters that can be very idiosyncratic and quirky and mean and funny. So I guess my question is, how do you balance that? And how did the book begin? Maybe that's the way to ask the question.
Right. Yeah. So this is the writing of this novel it's a story itself. So, but it began when, as you said, I think I am interested in love story. Actually, it started as a love story. It started as I was reading someone's diary. I like to read writers' diaries and people's diaries, and oftentimes, I read someone's diary, and then that leads me to read another person's diary because that person is in the footnote of the diary, and that leads to another footnote. So I was reading someone's diary, the footnote leading to more footnotes, and someone said something about, I think in the footnote there's a one letter said L, unidentified lover. So this is a man's lover who's not identified. I think, as a fiction writer, when we see that, we think, well, any unidentified lover has a story. So the novel started with thinking about Lilia being a footnote of Roland's diary. Yet Roland is a footnote of another woman's, a little bit more prominent. But that woman is a footnote in someone else's biography. So this is like a chain reaction. People are becoming more and more confined in the footnotes, but they all have their real stories. They all have their life stories. So I think it starts with me thinking about looking at a footnote and thinking about a footnote story, which is Lydia's story. And Lydia, of course, she's this 81-year-old looking back. She had 3 husbands, 17 children, and 5 children, 17 grandchildren. So she's lived a very full life, and her life is full of these details, but she's always circling around her dead child, Lucy, who committed suicide. So I think I started writing Lydia more just as a woman looking back and telling her story. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I think it's what she decides not to tell. She's always circling around Lucy. She doesn't want to talk about Lucy. She doesn't want to talk about her grief. So what Lydia does not tell in the end becomes, I guess, the novel itself in a way. So Lydia, as you said, she's mean, she's funny, she's very everyday. She talks about her garden. So all these quotidian details come with Lydia and come with her life. And I feel like my job is just to follow her and see what she thinks or what she does in life, if that makes sense.
She's such a rich character, and there's one part at the beginning of the novel where she says to Lucy's daughter, Lucy is the character, Lilia, is it Lilia?
Lilia, yeah.
Lilia, Lilia's daughter Lucy takes her life, and Lucy's daughter Catherine is a character in the book as well. And I remember there was one part where Lilia says to her about her mother that she was ill and she knew that no doctor could help her. And for me, I just thought that that was just really very lovely.
Yeah, I mean, I
You maintain a kind of a mystery, we can't solve life or people. That
yeah.
was another aspect that I really admired.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, because I think, I meant to ask you too about, how to write about grief, because, you write about grief and I write about grief, and Lydia is grieving, but she doesn't talk about her grief. And what kind of language a poet or a character uses for grief. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about the word grief lately because it's used so much and it's so overused. And I think people think that grief is, when we think of grief, we tend to think of it in the moment as if, the person who has died, it's that acute grief. And we don't really think about it as a lifetime grief. And so in Asylum, I really wanted to, to interrogate that idea because I've come to think of it as forever grief. And that grief, as I said, just isn't enough of a word to capture the loss of a loved one. And so I, like you in your novel, I think that that I wanted this idea that that parts of ourselves live on as they do, for instance, in the way that pollen works, and how I write about that in Asylum, and how these seeds drop and then other trees come alive, and then others get strangled by each other. And just, I guess I'm just thinking now so much about grief as being a life cycle that just regenerating.
Yeah, it's interesting you said, I do agree with you. I think grief is almost becoming like a shortcut for speaking about things that we cannot speak about, we cannot talk about. I also, in my previous novel, I also explored the grief, the etymology of grief. It's a burden, it's a heaviness. But we never, like if we lose someone, we never consider, thinking about that lost person as a burden. Right. So it's heaviness, but it's also, I like what you said, it's a cycle. It comes and goes. It's like waves. So
yes. And for me, I guess I felt that Lilia kind of embodies that as a character. I like the fact that she's older in the book, and then she's younger. That's a question I wanted to ask you, is how you shift that. The novel parts of it are when she's older and she's more, she's wise and she's a little difficult. She wants things a certain way. And then when she's young, and then she's 16 in parts of the novel.
Yeah, I think, everybody has a love story. That's sort of, I always believe that no matter what a novel is about, everybody has a story and everybody has a love story. And Lydia has a love story when she is 16. But no one can stay 16 forever. And I think more interesting to me is Lydia at 81, looking back at 16 and at her earlier years. And it's interesting, we were talking about how the book came to be the book. And I've never had a character who was so demanding to me. Even just when I was writing her, I started a novel early on in 2016. And I already was halfway through the novel. Lydia already lost Lucy, her daughter, and Lydia was 44 when that happened. And, you know, in the middle of the novel, it happened to me. I lost a child at 44. So in a way, I think that overlapping of biography, it was a little striking that I stopped writing the novel because I thought I couldn't write a novel, but Lydia was demanding in the way that she wants her story to be told. And I think in the end, when I came back after writing another novel, coming back to the novel, I realized Lydia has one advantage that I do not have, is Lydia has lived on 40 years, 30 years on. You know, decades later, she has these experience accumulated after her child's death. So I feel that, you know, maybe I was writing about Lydia just to know what she has to say to me from another time point in one life, in the life history. So that is, maybe that's why, you know, I feel that's how Lydia became this person, but I'm interested in her later wisdom. Can I ask you about, you know, because you talk about trees, I notice I read and reread your poems, this repetition, this, you know, re-emerging the trees and the images of trees. I want to talk a little bit about nature in this poem. And you talk a little, you said a little bit earlier about nature. What's striking to me is there's the nature and there's the everyday life, you know, in a yoga place, in the city, so how do you navigate the nature and life, you know, life outside nature or life isolated from nature?
No, I think it's a little bit about what you were saying about that, you know, your character Lilia, because I don't know, a strange thing happens when you start writing a long poem, that the poem kind of takes a hold of you and it forces you to go places that maybe you don't quite want to go. You know, I wrote an entire memoir, you know, I don't know if now it's been almost 8 years maybe since it was published, History of a Suicide, My Sister's Unfinished Life. And I really thought I would never write about it again.
Yeah.
And when I started Asylum, I didn't think I was going to be writing about it again, but it just kept resurfacing. And even in nature, you know, there are, you know, this idea of survival and trees that are snuffed out by other trees. You know, if you look at a stand of trees over time, you know, they are in some ways, you know, their branches are reaching toward light, but some can't find the light anymore. And then there are vines that come up and strangle other trees. And I write about that in the book. And, you know, I just have come to, again, I just go back to that idea of, you know, that we have to give dignity to those who survive and those, for whatever reason, at whatever point in time, can't. And so I wanted the poem to really keep circling that idea of survival, and nature, you know, becomes such just a wonderful contrast to reality. In some ways, you know, T.S. Eliot has that famous line about, you know, humankind cannot accept very much reality, which I love, and I think about that a lot. And like when there's so much, when we're looking at such extreme, you racial violence and fear of a race. An extinction is another theme in my book because I'm Jewish, and throughout the last 4 years, there's been this incredible unleashing of anti-Semitism, and this idea that a race can, or a religious body can be eliminated. That started evolving into my inquiry about, I don't know, I'm going on too long, but.
Can I just ask one more question, because you talk about circling, and as I said before to you, I often think about music when I read your poem, and sometimes it's like a phrase, and sometimes it's that, what do you call it, theme, or that as phrase, and sometimes it's the whole repetition of the theme. Are you a musician? Just curious, just out of curiosity.
No, thank you though. Yeah, I really have no musical talent, but I do hear words, I think as a poet, but for so many years, and I love rhyme, kind of sly rhyme, not always straightforward rhyme. And that creates a certain kind of music and incantation. So I was going, when you write something that's supposed to be a book-length poem, you have to change tones and shifts. And I think that that's probably like, an orchestra, when you hear a piece of music that is constantly changing its tone. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was really thinking of the poem as a kind of symphony of loud and quiet notes. Here's what I wanted to ask you, which I found utterly fascinating about your novel, is in some ways, do you think of it as a novel also about the process of writing and authenticity and truth? It's just very interesting to me that, Roland has this big diary that a relative transcribes and eliminates things. And Lilia is angry about that. And so she wants to leave a legacy for her family, and she tries to, well, she doesn't try, she actually goes in and incorporates aspects of reality. So I was just thinking about that in terms of what a novel can be, and whether you were playing with those ideas or not.
Yeah, I am, as I say, I like to read people's diaries, and I often wonder how much people make up things in their diaries. And especially people who know their diaries will be read after their death. For instance, when I was reading, the first line of the novel said, "Posterity, take notice." That's Roland speaking to the audience after his death. I actually learned, I was reading Catherine Mansfield's journals, and she kept a long journal. And sometimes in the middle of writing about her life, she would turn to the readers. She said, "Those of you who dare to read my diary after my death." And then she would have a very angry line addressing her posterity. So I like to think about how people, even in their most private space, words in a diary, how they think about who are the other people who are going to read them. So Roland certainly has kept diaries for 70 years, never really true. He's made up many things, exaggerated, but he had this grand dream of becoming a great novelist, and he was going to be remembered by people. And Lydia, on the other hand, I think Lydia is the reluctant memoirist. She was in the retirement home, and they asked her to take the memoir writing class. She did not want to, because she did not want to share her life with people. But as you said, there has to be something that has to be left for the future. And so Roland's diaries sort of offered Lily a structure, a scaffold to tell her own stories. And I think maybe I was thinking about how each person tells the story or does not tell the story, what they withhold, what they, lie about. So all these things, I think the two, I think the two narrative line, Lydia's annotation and Roland's diary, they to me, they're talking about life. And as you said, how much is true, how much is not. So it's always interesting to think about these things.
Yeah. And Lilia, she wants, doesn't she want her children to read this when she departs?
She wants to leave that for Lucy's daughter, because there was, her children said, well, how did Lucy die? Nobody really knows the truth. And she said, this is the truth. This is how Lucy died. So I think in the end, she did want to leave that to Lucy's daughter. So she has a record of her mother's story.
I have just one last question for you. And I was wondering, you mentioned that you lost a son to suicide. And I was wondering, did you start the book after that, or had you already been writing it before?
I was already writing it, and Lucy already died from suicide. So I think it was just one of those odd incidents in life that, I think life follows fiction in a way, and you cannot explain that, but that happens. What you said about earlier, you said about, human beings cannot accept reality, or how to accept reality. I feel that is just the reality is something happened when Lydia was 44 and something happened when I was 44, and it's the same tragedy. So it's a coincidence, but I think it did give me a new way to write about Lydia after.
Right. Yes, she's such a rich character.
Thank you. I think we may have to ask the questions.
Yes.
Yeah, let me see.
I'll look too.
So shall we just go from top, or?
Sure.
Yeah. So Dara.
She's, should I read the question?
I think we both can answer this question. Yes. Yeah.
She says that she came to the US as a refugee and struggled with the word home and language. Many people criticized me that I'm not American enough and Cambodian enough. It causes me a serious depression. I'm currently starting writing to get anger and anxious out. Do you have any recommendations for me as a new writer in person who has struggled not to feel home here?
I can say a few words about that. I came as a immigrant too. I grew up in another country, and English is not my first language. And I always say, there are two ways to look at it. One is, we speak English not as a perfect native speaker. We have an accent, but it also means we have another history. We have another culture behind us. And I think people would, I would say to Dara, people always say these things to discourage you. And I think as a writer, I think the best way is just to ignore these. These are noises, and these noises will always be there. When I started publishing, I heard these noises. Your English is not good enough, or why do you write about China? Why do you write about the darkness of China? People always grumble. So I think those people are not your readers, and your real readers and people who really care about your writing will read. What do you think, Jill?
Yes, I was thinking, I don't know why this popped into my head, but as an editor, I published the poetry at Norton of Marilyn Chin, is a wonderful poet. And her poetry is very much about the experience of assimilation and not quite knowing who she is, pulled by two different parts of, you know, her ancestry, and also growing up in America. And she once said to me, or I heard her, maybe she said it to me, or I heard her say it at a writer's conference, but she said, you know, in order to, what she does is she says that she writes to embarrass her ancestors. And that's really stayed with me. So I guess I would say to you that, you know, your obligation is to yourself as a writer, to your own story. And that really, I think, is the real obligation of a writer, is to their own, the way in which they interact with the world and within themselves, I guess. And there's so much wonderful literature being published right now, I think, about you know, identity and not feeling part of anything. So yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm just looking at time. Maybe I'm thinking we should answer some questions for both of us first.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this probably is a Ben's question. I think this is probably for both of us. I'm going to read. To what extent do historical events play in your work? How is the experience of personal loss connected to public trauma? Do these characters find solace or inspiration in their cultural traditions and rituals? So I think maybe we can both talk about that.
You want to begin?
You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I do think that that we inherit historical trauma, historical joy. I do feel that that we pass on, you know, the lives of others before us. So again, it's kind of, I would just go back to that idea of, you know, regeneration. And, you know, certainly for me in my poem, Asylum, I do recognize in the poem this idea of the history that we carry, and that stays with us. And in my book, it would be, you know, World War II and the devastation of the Jews. But I'm also, you know, thinking about other atrocities and racial discord. And I think we all carry this if we're sensitive human beings.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. You know, years ago, I had a friend who was teaching in Iowa, and he was teaching at a retirement home, actually not unlike Lydia's retirement home. And he told me this story. I always return to that story when I think about history. He said, you know, he had 3 students, 2 of them, 2 older Jewish women and 1 woman who, so the first Jewish woman spent her entire childhood in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. So she did not experience Holocaust in any way. So she was writing about her very idyllic childhood in 1940s without any reference to the historical events. Mm. And the other woman was a Holocaust survivor, or her family, you know, had lost families. So she was very angry. She said, you cannot write about this time without referring to the history. So she was writing the same period, but with an entirely different history. Mm. And the third woman was so baffled. So she decided to write a novel in which Hitler was assassinated before he came into power.
Mm.
So there's no pain, no trauma. History was different. So I always think about those three women and their approaches to history. In a way, I think I do think I agree. I think we always live in history. Nobody lives outside history.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think our personal history and public history always intersects. And I have not seen one person, or one great character who doesn't intersect with public history. So in a way, I think my thinking is we just write about each individual, each character, and how this person lives in history.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's probably just what I would say.
Oh, that makes sense to me. They reminded me what you just said of that Philip Roth novel where he rewrites history. It was a recent TV series. I'm blanking the title.
Plot Against America?
Yeah.
Yes.
And certainly in that novel, it's so much about history and its effects on further generations.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I'm not able to see the questions.
Oh, I can read. Maybe we each have one question.
Okay, go ahead.
Jill, can you talk about what you're most proud of especially, I think this is a maybe let me start out. Jill, can you talk about what you're most proud of, especially as it pertains to writers you have helped developed?
Oh, what I'm most proud of, I think, is having the opportunity to work with wonderful writers that I feel, I edit poetry. I also edit fiction and nonfiction, and I think that the wonderful part of what I do is watching the evolution of these writers now. For instance, I mentioned Marilyn Chin. Well, I started publishing her second book so many years ago, and now she's published probably 4 or 5 since that one. And now she just won this big award, the Ruth Lilly Prize from the Poetry Foundation. So for me, that's just, a great honor. And same with Joy Harjo, another poet I've worked with since 1998, who's now our poet laureate. And, so many wonderful fiction writers. And I think it's just the opportunity to be a part of literature, what I love most, both as a writer and an editor.
Great. So I'm going to answer one question maybe for myself, and I think we're about the time. Yeah. This is a question to you. Did you find challenges writing a character at a later point in life than yourself? Mm-hmm. I actually love writing about characters who are older than I am. Years ago, I learned writing. I always had learned writing by reading the Irish writer William Trevor. Mm. And in one interview, he said when he was younger, he liked to write about old people because he didn't know how it felt to be old. He had to imagine how an old person crossed the street and how an old person fell asleep. And he said that pushes him to just go out of himself and to imagine other characters. And he gave this interview when he was old. He said, now I'm old, I forgot my childhood. Now I started to write about children because I forgot how to be young. And so I always I always remember that interview. I think part of the reason I like to write about people whose experience is different than mine, I like to write about male characters and older characters, is because I don't know. And I don't know how it feels to be an 81-year-old woman. I think the challenge, of course, you have to get it right, but I think it really does push myself out of, like, it forces me to imagine as fully as possible. And also just to observe people. I think there's another question about, I talk about eavesdropping. I think eavesdropping is a way to observe people who are different than me. And so the challenges are, of course, you may be projecting your own feelings or experience, but I think I always try to be careful not to project. I just want to live in the characters, in a character's mind. And if I answer that question, I think there's a line saying maybe it's time. Is that time, Tom?
No, that wasn't saying time. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yes, but I think we're about time.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for this incredible, thoughtful conversation that you guys have had. Again, both of their books are available in the chat. And also Jill will be joining us on September 20th for a special reading of the late Stanley Plumley's Middle Distance, along with several other acclaimed poets. Thank you again. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you next time on PNP Live.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and great to see you.
Yes, thank you, Jill. Yes.
Thank you to Politics and Prose, such a great bookstore, one of my favorites. Thank you for hosting us. Okay.
Okay, thank you.